a designated research stakeholder of the Network for Greening the Financial System. We follow a 3-point mission. Firstly, to commission research. Secondly, to convene researchers and stakeholders, which includes the 100+ central banks, financial supervisors, and observer organizations who are part of the NGFS. And finally, to widely communicate insights in order to catalyze sustainable finance. So Inspire is co-hosted by the Grantham Research Institute and the Climate Works Foundation, and is co-chaired by Nick Robbins, who is with us today, and Naomi Granhoff. So to date, Inspire has commissioned about 35 projects across 7 thematic areas, which include the excellent research that we'll be hearing about today. Most recently, last month, we launched the joint NGFS Inspire study group for biodiversity and financial stability. And the purpose for doing this is, to date, central banks and financial supervisors have focused largely on climate change related financial risk. However, as COVID-19 and also this report we're talking about today has demonstrated, is that financial shocks can occur from an array of environmental sources. So the purpose of this joint study group, which comprises of both NGFS members and also researchers, is we're working together to understand the potential implications of biodiversity loss and financial stability. So today we're joined by an excellent panel of speakers. Dr. Daniel Szydlowski is the author of the report, and he will shortly present his work. Danny is a distinguished research scholar at the GDP Center and has a very impressive curriculum, including having served as superintendent of the Banking, Insurance and Private Pension Fund Administrator of Peru. He's been the chairman of the Governing Council of the Alliance of Financial Inclusion, and has also been member of the board of the Central Bank of Peru. And among other very notable positions, we're very privileged to have Danny as part of the joint NGFS study group for biodiversity and financial stability. So it's fantastic to have him on board. Following a 10-minute presentation from Danny, where he'll summarize the findings of the report, we should then hear from 3 discussants. Mariana Escobar is head of sustainable finance at the Superintendencia Financiera de Colombia. Mariana has also served as City Colombia Sustainability Manager, and has been public policy advisor to the director of the Department of Social Prosperity. Her work is largely focused on sustainable finance, financial inclusion, and fintech initiatives. We will then hear from Pascal O'Doherty, who is the Secretary General of the Association of Supervisors of the Bank of Americas. And before joining the ASBA in 2019, Pascal has been the General Director of Financial Stability at the Banco de Mexico, and Executive Secretary to the Mexican Financial Stability Council, among other roles. He's had different responsibilities in the area of financial stability, financial system regulation, and central bank operations during his 30+ years with the Mexican Central Bank. It's a pleasure for me today to co-moderate this session with my colleague Nick Robbins, who is co-chair of the Inspire Secretariat and the Joint Study Group for Biodiversity and Financial Stability, and also Professor of Practice in Sustainable Finance at the London School of Economics. Following Mariana and Pascal, I shall then hand over to Nick for his comments and for moderation of the Q&A. So again, a reminder, we hope that this webinar will be available simultaneously in English and Spanish. And if you have any questions or comments, please enter those into the Q&A or chat section. So with no further ado, I'll now hand over to Dr. Szydlowski.
Well, thank you very much, Natasha. So let me share. Here we go. Let me share my PowerPoint so that folks can follow me on my presentation. Now, there's a real challenge for supervisors and regulators in Latin America. COVID has temporarily hijacked our attention. Everybody's focused on COVID. And that's right. That should be so. It's justified to be so. COVID has generated huge problems with employment. It's really generated huge problems with fiscal space. Governments have spent all sorts of money trying to provide sustenance for those who are out of work. And it's changed around the role of the state. So where perhaps the Washington consensus was prevalent at earlier day, now suddenly that's reverted. The state turns out to be absolutely essential to cure things. Um, but yet underlying problems remain nonetheless. Latin America has all sorts of socio-environmental conflicts. Mining companies and their neighbors don't get along. Logging companies cut down the forests of the Amazon and in Central America. Um, there are plenty of conflicts of this sort. There are also climate emergencies. Um, there's storms, there's floods. There's been recently in Central America, particularly the Caribbean as well. And then, of course, there is long-term climate change, which we tend to think of as being sort of insidious, but it's now accelerating. And so that's certainly there and needs to be dealt with. So regulators at the moment have a substantial challenge because they've got COVID, but they've got these other underlying issues that need to be dealt with. And so some combination has to be found. And what we've worked on in the working group is precisely to try to craft something, to craft some departures of policy or some adjustments that allow regulators to cope with these issues. Now, what's changed? What's different now post-COVID as compared to pre-COVID? Uh, One of the things that's different is that we've had a huge economic recession, 5%, 8%, 10%, 12%, 20%, simultaneous cutbacks in output and consumption. But as distinct from other cases where there have been recessions, this has been by orders of the government. For good public health reasons, people have been ordered to stay at home. But if they stay at home, they can't work. If they can't work, they cannot produce. And so we've induced a recession by government orders. Now that's totally off the charts. That's never happened before. At the same time, there have been large subsidies to the population and there have been government guaranteed credits. That's again a totally new departure. That's never happened before. So we have a totally different macro context for regulation. But now the other two things that have happened have been extremely important. There's been an awareness of externalities that hasn't existed before. Everybody now understands that whatever they do in their personal life affects everybody else. It's clearly demonstrated where masks are involved. If I don't wear a mask, I'm subjecting others to danger. And if they don't wear a mask, it's subjecting me to danger. But this is just sort of the beginning, the tip of the iceberg, because as this works its way through, it's been discovered that externalities are very strongly present. And we've seen that the supply and payment chains have been subject to externality problems. If in China there are no chips being produced, that means you cannot produce cars in Detroit. And on it goes. So it's impossible now to deny the existence and strong presence of externalities, where before both economists and others have thought, well, externalities are there and what a nuisance, but they're not important. Now it's very clear they're very important. And of course, the big externality is climate change. That affects everybody as well. And now it's impossible to deny that. Now, the other things that are new is that there have been substantial lessons of public administration as the state has gotten more involved. It's been obligated to step in and it's learned a lot of things. Now, at the same time, there's been a forced innovation of public policy instruments and their application. So the world is different. The world that confronts regulators now is different from what it was before COVID. And that indeed requires updating and changing, improving the kind of regulatory system that we've had before. Now, what happens when externalities are everywhere? This is a different world. When externalities are everywhere, we need to internalize them. Internalization of externalities has become the core requirement for any regulatory system. Now, what does this mean? Do we have a tool for this? Yes, indeed. ESRM, the Environmental and Social Risk Management Tool, has been available for quite a while, but it has not been compulsory before. It now needs to become compulsory. It tackles COVID-19 recovery. It tackles socio-environmental conflicts. It tackles climate change. Why? Because it essentially brings in the externalities into the day-to-day functioning of the financial system of banks, insurance companies, and others. At the same time, there's a second channel in which it can be reinforced, which is through the state-owned development banks. These can lead the application and implementation of the ESRM. So this is the core around which the new regulatory system needs to be built. And this is something that our working group spent a lot of time on and which is emphasized in the report. But it doesn't end there. There need to be complementary policies to support this internalization of externalities. Now, they come in a variety of shapes. Let me give you some example. For instance, there needs to be provisioning on loans for electric vehicles. Now, that is essentially giving preferential conditions for sectoral transformation. Let's finance a change in the structure of the transportation fleet. That's an example, but there are more, of course. And in the report, we go into some detail. There are connectivity and inclusion policies that are complementary. For instance, favorable regulation for digital accounts on cell phones. And then there is a third category, which is very, very important, which is to build institutional social overhead capital to enable the markets to function more effectively. Essentially, to give everybody easy access to information and regulation, such as internet access to property titles, georeference rainfall and temperature data, things that companies and enterprises and others in the economy need to have easy access to without having to spend time and money and perhaps never achieving access. These things are necessary to support the internalization of externalities, and therefore they are complements to the basic policy, which is the ESRM implementation. But of course, there are always also urgencies. We have to respect the urgencies. We can't simply say, well, let's do it in our own good time. No, there are urgencies that need to be respected. The first important urgency is COVID-19 recovery. There need to be specific things adopted, policies adopted for that purpose, which the report addresses. One important issue is the managing of increased public debt. All governments around the world and in Latin America as well have borrowed significantly, have spent significantly more than before. Some of that has been financed by debt. Some of it has been financed by running down balances. Well, how do we manage this? So there's a new requirement to manage public expenditures and public debt. And the second issue, which is also very important, is unwinding government credit guarantees. Now, this has been a new instrument with which is very little experience, but you cannot keep on guaranteeing private loans forever. The government's got to get out of this business. How does it do this? And what kind of regulations are needed to do this in a proper way and in a way without harming the enterprises that have been financed? So COVID-19 recovery has some specifics. We've addressed these in the report. Climate disasters will continue to occur. Indeed, even while we were in session, Central America was swept by storms. Now, the two things that are essential. One is you need to have contingency policy for business continuity in place. And then you need, of course, to have contingency policy for recovery. Now, trouble with disasters is if you don't plan ahead for them and decide what you're going to do when they occur, then you're going to scramble and you won't do them very well. So there needs to be contingency policies developed. Now,
Danny, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you indeed. That'll be fine. I also need to redefine creditworthiness. There's a real difference if there is a particular enterprise which loses creditworthiness, or if there's a context where everybody was in trouble, but also now everybody recovers. There is an externality to becoming a better credit risk. As Joe finds that his sales go up and he has recovery, he becomes a better credit risk, and then Peter becomes a better credit risk as well. So this is again an area in which the externalities dominate. Again, this is new. Typically, we don't have that situation. We've got examples before, but this is new. So we've got, on the one hand, we need to have long-term policies, which we need to apply when externalities are everywhere. And then we have urgencies that need to be respected. Where do we come out? We come out on some interesting areas. First thing we recognize is that finance is everywhere, just like climate is everywhere. Indeed, as we think about it, there is very little else that's like climate in terms of being everywhere. So it's appropriate that we use financial tools to address climate issues. The second thing that we conclude is that financial regulation is a very powerful lever because precisely finance is everywhere, and because small changes in regulation have very substantial effects on the economy. So we can enlist financial regulation to effect your desired change. Our working group has worked hard and carefully to come together to illustrate and bring together a range of things that can be done that are within the experience of regulators, but which involve addressing these new issues that now have to be dealt with. We're therefore confident that we can move forward collectively and indeed improve our capacity to deal with the externalities that are now everywhere and that need to be addressed, and to make a substantial contribution from the financial regulation side in order to address climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny, for an excellent overview. Now over to Mariana for your thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you very much for this invitation. I've seen some comments in the chat box regarding the interpretation. So I was going to speak in English, but I think I'll try Spanish because what I see is that there is a lot of Spanish-speaking audience, I guess. For those who didn't understand, the Superintendencia is the Financial Supervisory Authority of Colombia, and I am the head of sustainable finance at that entity. So I'm going to switch into Spanish because of the comments I see in the chat. Maybe it's going to help, and maybe in the Q&A section I'll do English, just to have half and half. So, primero, antes de empezar, como colombiana, creo que me debo referir a la situación en Colombia porque creo que hay un vínculo con esta discusión. Como bien lo mencionó Daniel, la pandemia, el COVID-19, creó un nuevo reto para los países en el mundo, pero en especial para los latinoamericanos. Como todos bien sabemos, la pandemia ha pegado fuertemente a los países en Latinoamérica, no solamente por el número de muertes, sino también por la crisis socioeconómica que ha generado estos encierros, digamos, generalizados y estrictos que han surgido en algunos de estos países. En el caso colombiano específicamente, hubo, como mencionó Daniel, un switch off de la economía. En un momento dado, a todos nos mandaron para las casas, de manera muy, muy estricta. Creo que fue una de las cuarentenas más estrictas y nos impidieron a muchas familias ir a su trabajo, abrir sus negocios por un largo periodo de tiempo. Esto sumado a que Colombia tiene una población, digamos, trabajadora altamente informal, que muchos de los empleos en Colombia dependen de industrias o sectores que tienen alto contacto. Si bien tenemos una industria de servicios importante, hay muchísima gente que depende de estas industrias, y que además Colombia le estaba apostando a esta etapa de posconflicto a esas industrias asociadas al turismo, a ese sector del turismo, a apostarle al turismo como fuente de ingresos complementarios en esas zonas atacadas por la guerra. Esta situación ha llevado a muchas familias a caer en la pobreza, como lo indicaron las cifras que surgieron la semana pasada, y ha llevado, y yo creo que la reforma tributaria que presentó el país, que creo que va a tener que pasar, digamos, de alguna manera en diferentes países en la región, y que considero que Colombia es como ese país piloto en lo que se viene para los países de Latinoamérica que se vienen enfrentados, digamos, a tener que tomar este tipo de decisiones y aumentar los ingresos de los gobiernos y el recaudo de impuestos. Entonces, vemos como las familias o como este fue el detonante para lo que en realidad se resume como un detonante del inconformismo, digamos, y de la falta, yo creo que de confianza que tiene la población y los ciudadanos en nuestros países frente a las instituciones públicas, instituciones privadas. Dentro de las instituciones privadas, la banca, especialmente Colombia, tiene un lugar especial en el corazón del inconformismo, ¿no? Lo vimos al principio de la pandemia, lo vemos en este momento donde todos demandan, digamos, mucha más alineación, digamos, si uno quisiera leer entre líneas lo que está pasando es que los ciudadanos quieren mucha más alineación o verse reflejados en los intereses de los privados, quieren ver cómo el privado en verdad está preocupado por el bienestar de todos y cómo se alinea esos valores que hoy por hoy los representan a esa, digamos, a esa población o a esos jóvenes que hoy por hoy son los que están saliendo a protestar. Y yo creo que esto me lleva a atarlo a una de las principales conclusiones o de las dos principales conclusiones que mencionó Daniel. La primera claramente es que el COVID nos presenta un nuevo punto de partida para muchas cosas. No estamos en el mismo país que antes del COVID. Lo segundo, creo que cada vez el sector privado y el sector financiero tiene que estar mucho más consciente de las externalidades y de las interdependencias. No solamente podemos seguir operando sin pensar cuál es ese impacto negativo o cómo podemos agregar, de hecho, y podemos ir más allá, no solamente gestionar el impacto negativo, sino también pensar en cómo se genera, perdón, thank you, perdón, mija, sino también cómo se genera, sino también cómo se... Gracias. Sino también cómo se genera, digamos, ese valor hacia la sociedad y se ve reflejado, digamos, y la sociedad se ve reflejado en esas acciones que toma el sector privado y la banca. Entonces, digamos que ahí reiterar esas dos conclusiones porque creo que son muy importantes y para el estado en el que estamos en Colombia es muy importante. En la recuperación el rol del sistema financiero se vuelve clave y parte de lo que tiene que hacer el sector financiero en esa recuperación es incorporar o interiorizar esas externalidades de una manera mucho más eficiente y sistemática, digamos. Esto no puede ser un esfuerzo de algunos bancos, sino del sistema financiero en general. Ya para finalizar mi intervención, sí quiero darle, digamos, reacción a algunas de las principales conclusiones del documento, unas reacciones específicas. Lo primero es sobre la obligatoriedad del ESRM o del SARAS, como le dicen en Colombia. Yo creo que una de las condiciones que nosotros consideramos que es clave para que esto se vuelva una condición, digamos, mínima o transversal en todo el sistema financiero es que tanto el mercado como la supervisión esté capacitada y convencida. De nada sirve que pongamos o que incluyamos esto en parte de nuestros sistemas obligatorios dentro del sistema financiero desde la perspectiva, digamos, de supervisión basada en riesgos si el sistema financiero no está convencido de su incorporación y si nosotros como supervisores no sabemos entender esto mucho más allá de algo de cumplimiento, ¿no? De que es un sistema que tienen que tener, sino más bien desde esa perspectiva de esto ayuda a gestionar muchísimo mejor los riesgos. Y esto lo llevo a un siguiente punto que mencionaba Daniel en su paper asociado a los riesgos físicos y de transición y la necesidad o no de tener esa clasificación. Yo creo que más allá de la clasificación, lo que nosotros hemos visto es que digamos que la presentación de estos conceptos de riesgos físicos y de riesgos de transición, lo que ha significado para los sistemas de ESRM tradicionales, estos que se derivaron de los principios del Ecuador, presentan un cambio en su paradigma. Ya no es suficiente pensar en cuál es mi impacto en el medio ambiente, cuál es mi impacto en la sociedad, sino cómo esos cambios en la sociedad, esos cambios demográficos, el COVID o cómo el aumento de la temperatura va a afectar mi negocio, cuál es el impacto de esos asuntos en mi negocio. Y creo que ahí es ese cambio de paradigma que tenemos nosotros como supervisores y la industria que incorporar en sus sistemas de administración de riesgo social y ambiental. El otro punto que quería hablar es los principios de proporcionalidad y digamos, el entendimiento del concepto de materialidad. Don't worry, this is my last point. Yo creo que en nuestros mercados es muy importante a la hora de introducir los sistemas de administración de riesgos, reconocer, digamos, este principio de proporcionalidad, especialmente si hacemos supervisión basada en riesgos, porque claramente hay unas industrias o sectores, y de hecho si metemos el cambio climático también tiene que ver mucho como con la ubicación geográfica de la cartera o de los portafolios de los bancos, tiene que ver mucho con la exposición a los riesgos. Entonces yo sí creo que el concepto de proporcionalidad es clave a la hora de introducir el sistema de administración de riesgo social y ambiental. Y lo último, ya para cerrar, este concepto de materialidad. Digamos, esta discusión alrededor de los diferentes entendimientos de qué es materialidad, stakeholder materiality o materialidad de grupos de interés, materialidad financiera en el marco de cambio climático y otros temas ambientales, y materialidad dinámica, digamos, es una conversación que está muy centrada en los ejercicios de divulgación, pero creo que a la hora de gestión de riesgo también es muy relevante, y creo que cuando se hable de SRM es muy importante que se diferencie y que haya un entendimiento frente a estos conceptos. Y ahí dejo mi intervención y cualquier otra duda pues la dejo en el espacio de Q&A, y le doy la palabra a la siguiente persona.
Thanks, Mariana. Some excellent points there about the importance of double materiality, so the impact of finance and the impact on finance, and also the importance of having public and private institutions representing society. Pascal, over to you for your thoughts.
Well, thanks. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Boston University Global Development Center, and in particular, Danny, for the invitation to participate in this webinar on greening financial regulatory policy in Latin America. The recent challenges that financial system in our region face from climate change is one of the top priorities in the agenda of the Latin American and Caribbean supervisors, and therefore is a key element in NASBA agenda. And I will follow Mariana an example, and I will switch to Spanish to facilitate the audience. Bueno, como les mencionaba, los riesgos y desafíos que trae el cambio climático para los sistemas financieros es uno de los temas prioritarios en la agenda de los supervisores de nuestra región. El propósito de mi intervención será enfatizar la necesidad de que la agenda de cambio climático dé la adecuada preponderancia a la cooperación y coordinación internacional. El cambio climático y los riesgos que este genera para la economía y los sistemas financieros del mundo han sido los temas más debatidos durante las últimas décadas, sobre todo últimamente debido a las manifestaciones que se han venido dando en el planeta por la existencia de este fenómeno. Es claro que el cambio climático es importante para el medio ambiente y nuestro planeta, pero lo que hasta ahora no era evidente es que el cambio climático también genera importantes riesgos financieros. Estos riesgos pueden dividirse en los riesgos físicos, ya sean fenómenos meteorológicos agudos como incendios o inundaciones, o tendencias climáticas de más largo plazo, como puede ser la subida del mar. Y los llamados riesgos de transición, que son los que derivan de los cambios en las políticas gubernamentales, la tecnología y las preferencias de los consumidores. Es difícil decir ahora cuál va a ser la combinación exacta entre riesgos físicos y riesgos de transición que vamos a experimentar en el mediano plazo, pero lo que sí es absolutamente cierto es que alguna combinación de estos riesgos se materializará. Entonces, el debate sobre las medidas que deberían implementarse pues, ha sido muy extenso y frecuentemente liderado por las economías avanzadas. Por ejemplo, pues, medidas para promover el uso de energías renovables o el pago de un impuesto por las emisiones de carbono. Sean cuales sean las medidas, es necesario reconocer que las medidas generan costos económicos. Por ejemplo, pues si como parte de las medidas se implementara un impuesto a sectores más contaminantes, pues esto aumentaría los costos y reduciría la rentabilidad de los sectores afectados. Esto podría disminuir la capacidad de repago de las empresas y con ello, pues como sabemos, incrementar la morosidad. Además, un eventual aumento de costos pues, podría también reflejarse en problemas de liquidez. A este posible impacto sobre el sistema financiero y la estabilidad financiera es lo que en las literaturas se conoce como riesgo de transición. Para enfrentar los riesgos de transición y de manera más generalizada para promover un menor una menor emisión que revierte el problema del calentamiento global, es fundamental que la solución se formule a escala global. Y este es el punto que quiero hacer. Esto es que involucre a todos los países del planeta, tanto economías avanzadas como emergentes, y esto liga de cierta manera con las recomendaciones de obligatoriedad que contiene el informe. Una primera característica de este fenómeno es que todos los países del mundo se perjudican por la contaminación, independientemente de quién la genera. No obstante, el impacto que un solo país pueda tener sobre el total de las emisiones globales de manera aislada, pues es relativamente pequeña. Además, si una economía avanzada intentara por sí sola disminuir sus emisiones, pues podrían producirse fugas de emisiones hacia economías emergentes. De igual manera, una reducción en la demanda por combustibles fósiles pues puede hacer más accesible su uso en otras economías. Debido a esta naturaleza de bien público, pues no es posible encontrar una solución que involucre solo a unas economías y que deje a otras fuera de la discusión. Es por ello que la agenda de cambio climático debe dar preponderancia a la cooperación y coordinación internacional, poniendo énfasis en la voz de las economías emergentes. De manera más concreta, esto significa, entre otras cosas, que dicha solución coordinada debe considerar que los riesgos de transición y la dificultad de implementar medidas para reducir las emisiones podrían ser mayores en economías que presentan más rezagos en la implementación de políticas de mitigación, con un menor acceso a tecnologías para producir en una manera más limpia y con menos recursos económicos para hacer frente a los posibles efectos adversos. Es decir, es fundamental que la solución coordinada considere las dificultades y las idiosincrasias de las economías emergentes. En este sentido, pues celebramos la iniciativa del Global Development Policy Center de buscar diseños de políticas regulatorias que propicien que los agentes económicos internalicen los efectos directos e indirectos de sus decisiones. Y creo que este es un punto muy importante que este reporte enfatiza. Y para ello se considera que un instrumento eficiente puede ser el llamado Sistema de Administración de Riesgos Ambientales y Sociales. La obligatoriedad de aplicar el SARAS en todo el sistema financiero pues permitiría que las decisiones individuales internalicen los efectos que tienen sobre terceros. Y con esto concluiría yo mi intervención.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for touching on the challenges of the global commons and the need for really international collaboration. With that, I'd like to hand over to Nick Robbins, who will be moderating the rest of this session.
Thank you very much, Natasha. It's a real pleasure to follow Danny's presentation and Mariana and Pascual, your comments. Unfortunately, I'm going to speak in English, if that's okay. So first, real congratulations to the working group. And I think what really struck me about reading this paper is that this is a product of many minds from many countries in the region. And therefore, I think the conclusions that you have collectively come together, and Danny, thank you for your leadership, make this a very robust paper and hopefully one which is of relevance to many countries in the region. So I think actually this is not just yet another paper, but actually comes from the brains of many people and is a great collective effort. So that's the first one. I think maybe a second point is about the nature of the crisis which we have experienced, this terrible COVID crisis. And I think it has been called the first crisis of the Anthropocene, but we know that degradation of nature, deforestation, and so on, has been one of the ways in which zoonotic diseases have transferred from the world of animals to our society. And so if we need any example of the materiality of macroprudential risks from environmental degradation, COVID-19 is a demonstration of that in terms of the catastrophic impacts on human life, but also our economies, as we've set out. So I think this will be an accelerator of action around green finance. And I think the paper is a factor of that. It also, as we know, is a major accelerator of some of the economic transformation. I think particularly in the fossil fuel sector, oil and gas sector, and so on, that the transition away from fossil fuels will be accelerated by this crisis. Then if I can turn to the tool, one of the core recommendations of this paper, economic environmental and social risk management. Clearly, a practice that is it does exist in the private sector, in banks and investors and so on. But I think putting this forward as a practical tool which internalizes externalities, but also captures both the environmental and social risks is really important. And as the paper says, this is something that needs to be part of the prudential toolkit and become a requirement in terms of the expectations of how financial firms, regulated firms are managing their risks. One of the things I'm very impressed about is that this is not separating environmental and social risks, but sees this integrated whole. And I think that's another lesson of this crisis, that we can't separate environmental agenda, climate change, biodiversity from social issues. So again, this is a very, very practical tool. And then maybe just some closing thoughts from me about where next. This recovery, this paper is positioned as how the countries of Latin America individually and together can deploy green financial regulatory measures to support the recovery from this terrible crisis. Danny, in your presentation, you highlighted some of the fiscal challenges that exist in terms of the increasing debt there. We may want to discuss in the discussion session a lot of debate that's going on now about debt restructuring and linking that to nature and environment. That might be one way of thinking about that. Secondly, clearly on prudential measures, how can prudential actions by supervisors, by regulators using this ESRM tool, how can that improve the quality of financing in this crisis? And then you do touch on the role of development banks, national development banks, but also regional and international development banks in providing capital. I think the one challenge for all of us is how do we come out of this with an investment-led recovery, one that is going to be investing in the type of patterns of development we're going to need. And that's a real challenge. So those would be my comments and thoughts on the paper. As I said, a really great paper in itself, but I'm delighted as co-chair of the Inspire Network to have this as one of the growing portfolios of papers that we have. So if I can change my metaphorical hat from a contributor to a moderator, if that's now my new role, I would really like to think about what's next. We've had a number of comments already. We've had one also from Kevin Gallagher, obviously a distinguished member of the Boston team. And Kevin's question, I think, is a really good one, is sort of the strategies that are proposed. Do countries have to adopt them one by one? Or is there a way in which sort of regional initiatives can take them forward, particularly as this came out of a collective working group? And Pasquale, in your role as Secretary General of ASBA, it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts about how individual countries can take this forward, but also how countries in the region can work together on this on a coordinated approach. I don't know who would like to start on that. Pasquale, please.
No, I believe this is a very interesting and actually a key point. As we have been discussing, it's because of the externalities and the risk that if you only have some countries applying some rules and the others are not, well, you can have like industries or more contamination moving to the countries that are not applying this. So it's very important that we have some sort of international coordination, and especially in the region. Or as you know, this international coordination is not easy to obtain. And we are seeing this, what happened in the last years, and now, well, it seems that things are going back in track. In the region, talking about the region, one of the things that we face is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the characteristics of the countries. So even when this is the same region, we cannot talk about the same kind of characteristics. There are countries that are, even with the COVID, they are at different stage, and some countries are really performing much worse than others, and that's a fact. So it will be difficult to try to coordinate something at the regional level. However, that doesn't mean that we should not try to have as more dialogue as possible. And I think that one important thing will be that whatever measures individual countries take, we end up with some sort of harmonization in the measures. It will be really good to have some kind of, I don't know if best principles or standardization of how these measures should be applied. So that's probably the way that we should work with. It's to have a global compromise, I think will be more difficult, but at least to have a very open dialogue among countries in the region in which they can enrich each other, discussing the kind of measures that might work better and might be more feasible to apply. So what we are going to do in our organization is try to promote this open dialogue among countries that are probably ahead in the measures with countries that are still trying to see what kind of measures they should be applied.
Great. And Marianne, how do you see that dynamic between national action in Colombia, where you're sort of leading on the sustainable finance front, and this regional coordination?
Okay. I think the first idea I will throw out there is that individual supervisors cannot wait until there is a regional consensus on how to approach these issues, because many of these decisions are based on their internal capacity, commitment, and also in the vulnerability of their economies, how much they're exposed to certain, are exposed to certain sectors or industries that are more critical for certain environmental issues or social issues, extractive industries, obviously oil and gas, for example. That also depends on, and if you're talking about physical risk or climate change impacts, direct impacts, if you are near the coast, or if you depend on agriculture and you depend on the precipitations patterns. I mean, it depends on each country's vulnerability as well. So I don't think my recommendation wouldn't be for other supervisors to wait until there is a regional consensus. However, there needs to be a space for you to coordinate, share and promote the incorporation of these issues, because, for example, in the case in Colombia, that Colombian banks have exposure in Central America, and that's just an example because of the ownership they have in banks in that region. We need for them to level up and start developing their own systems. This can be done through different scenarios where you kind of share what you're doing, and you try to, using, for example, the supervisory colleges, trying to explain what you're doing and why it's important for the region, for other regions or other jurisdictions to step it up. There are also global initiatives. Obviously, most of you, I guess, know, we're here at Inspire event. So the NGFS obviously also provides kind of more of a global space for you to understand what others are doing and see what you can incorporate in your jurisdiction. And for Colombia also, there is Alianza Pacifico. The Pacific Alliance is also a space where we have been trying to incorporate green finance and climate finance and ESG, environmental and social risk assessments, in the discussions with our supervisors. So there is a space. You need to continue kind of opening the dialogue, as Pascual mentioned, but you shouldn't wait for others to start, for you to start.
Great. And over to you, Danny, your reflections on sort of best ways forward.
Yes, I think that externalities being externalities, if you have a single country adopting an ERSM and the neighboring country does not, what will then happen is that essentially you'll get the finance being distorted and people will finance offshore and essentially do an end run around your policy. So it's very important for each country itself to have the neighbors also adopt the policies. Otherwise they're much less effective. Now, how do you get there? I think the broad outlines, of ESADAs, as they're called in Spanish, are pretty clear. And they're not terribly different from one country to another. So, Central America, for instance, has fairly similar economies, and you think could adopt roughly the same regulation, even though it might then be applied in particular different ways. And, I think now where you have where you have multinational banks or banks owned by cross holdings across countries. In the case of Central America, a lot of the Colombian banks actually own Central American banks in more than one country. So of course you think they have some interest in there not being very different regulations. Otherwise you get regulatory arbitrage. So, there is a very strong argument to adopt things very similarly. But then, perhaps implementation and respecting the issues that Mariana brought up, where it makes a difference exactly where you are, and we're looking at all those things are true. So in the operational side, you want to respect differences, but you want to have a roughly similar structure. And above all, you want to make sure that everywhere it's compulsory. You cannot have compulsory regulations in 3 places and then non-compulsory in 5 others. That's a pandemonium, and they have to be equally firmly implemented. You can't have a situation where something is nominally compulsory, but banks can do anything they want as long as they have something. It needs to be roughly similar. And I think, Pascual's organization, ASBA, is an excellent forum to get general consensus and maybe have a sort of a model regulation developed that that everybody can use as a starting point. Then there will be minor adjustments along the way. But now I think what we've learned from COVID is that, boy, if we don't get together and do things in a coordinated fashion, we're all going to be worse off. So it's a good time to move forward. And where 2 years ago it was very hard, I think now it's much easier. The recognition of interdependence has grown enormously. Everybody understands we're interdependent, so we can move on and use the trauma of COVID in a positive way.
Thanks very much, Danny. So one of the good question that we've had, I mean, obviously one of the new developments, so during the COVID crisis, obviously we have a new administration in the US. And I just wondered, this is directed at you, Pascual, but others may want to jump in. I mean, are there any, how could that shape the dynamic? Is there any particular partnership with the US and any particular way in which the US government and administration could support this greening of financial regulation in the region?
Yeah, I think that what I believe is that with climate change, we can see something similar that what happened with MLA and FT. As fighting climate change becomes a more crucial element in the US agenda, I could see that in the near future, they might put conditions in a sort of things to push for this agenda. I think that I don't see any difference in the risks. Well, there are differences, but I think it's a big threat, as is MLA. So looking at what the US agenda is right now with the new administration, I won't be surprised if there is putting some sort of more extreme measures in the kind of aid that they provide, linked to climate change fighting. Great,
thank you. I mean, one question we've had, another question is, I think when we've been discussing incorporating environmental risk into prudential practice, in most cases, the answer has been that these are material factors, and regulators can incorporate those without any change in their mandate. But I think the question that's interesting here is, do we need a broader public debate about the role of regulations, or can regulators go ahead as independent bodies? And do we indeed need to revise mandates? Do we need legislation? Or could this ESRM tool be applied just as part of a sort of a risk-based approach? I don't know, Mariana, if you had any thoughts on that one.
I think obviously when you're in a country and you're doing regulation, you cannot work in silos necessarily. I mean, whatever any government agency's decision, any other government entities' decisions will impact, especially in these issues, the way you approach that risk or that opportunity, actually, if you're also talking about opportunity. However, since climate change, I mean, there is a very broad recognition that environmental issues, social issues, and especially climate change are material issues, can become financial risks and prudential risks. So I don't think we need for other government agencies to make decisions in order for us to incorporate it in our work, in whatever we do from the supervisory perspective, right? However, it does help that you are coordinated and that you understand that you understand where the country is going, what policies are being implemented, because that changes the way they would do actually risk-based supervision. I mean, if there is not enough institutional arrangement, for example, for social dialogue, then that might affect the way you see risk in certain industries, the way you do, I forgot the word in English, but if there is not an institutional framework and security for you to have, I forgot the word, but a consensus with the communities, or if you don't have a proper environmental license institution, like the licensings are not very well developed, then maybe you have even higher risks from the social perspective, actually. So obviously the changes, this risk changes in the way that the government changes with the government approach to them, but it shouldn't be dependent on them, obviously. And when you talk with climate change, that's it's even more visible, because your government your vulnerability to physical risks and your government commitment to international objectives, climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives, will basically change the way this risk can transmit to the economy and to the financial sector.
Great. Any points on that in terms of the ability of supervisors to act within their current sort of mandates to adopt the ESRM approach? Over to you, Danny.
Yes, there are people who are purists and to say that central banks and regulators should be narrowly focused on inflation, and that's their mandate. And there are very strong political positions of that sort in Latin America. Almost every country there is a group that says, don't muck about with all these other things. That's diluting the mandate. Now, one can think of that as an old-fashioned view, but it is strongly represented, and the central bank shouldn't be messing about with other things than just making sure that there's price stability. On the other hand, it's equally true that every country pretty much has subscribed things under the Paris agreements and have obligations, and that in principle gives adequate legislative authorization for any part of the government to get involved in something that they can do. Now, from a risk point of view, there is no question that regulators, when they're dealing with risk, are well within their mandate. But where does risk stop, and where are you really transgressing on something that is a little far from your mandate? And this is a political discussion. I think we should not minimize the possibility that there's backlash. My own view is we need to move ahead as fast as we can, because there's no time to be lost. But there are people on the other side who are going to be saying, no, you lost your mission. And, don't dilute what you're doing.
Very good. Well, we're coming up to the last few minutes, and I'd really like to hear from all of you, essentially building on this paper, the work through the working group. What are sort of your priorities to take forward the greening financial regulation in your areas, particularly in the context of the the huge economic and social crisis that we're facing? So maybe Pascual, if I could start with you. Obviously, a very broad mandate you have at ASBA. I mean, how do you see taking forward this sort of green financial regulation agenda in the coming months?
Well, there are many initiatives taking place in the region. The the BID is also working on this. So I think that what we can do really to improve the dialogue and the awareness of these issues is to organize within the organization, within the ASVA, channels of communication in which countries that are really ahead in the implementation of measures and who have had more time to think about them, share their experiences with other countries, and together we can find like some sort of best ways ahead in which countries that do not have the resources or the opportunity or the expertise to think about this could benefit from what other countries are doing. And with this interchange of ideas among members, we can sort like try to devise among them which could be the most feasible, viable, and optimal measures that they can take. Is what we have in mind for the agenda. Is more coordination, but in the way of convincing people, convincing members, and through open dialogue, find what will be the best viable, reliable measures that they can take. That's what we can contribute to that.
Very good, Pascual. Very, very helpful, I think. Mariana, to you, your priorities to take forward this agenda in the coming months.
Thank you. Actually, and kind of building up of what Daniel mentioned regarding the mandate of their institutions and how they see the role, at least from the Colombian perspective, since 2018, we realized that this was it was within our mandate. We were aware of the discussions, but since the supervisory authorities are outside of the central bank, at least in Colombia, we were able to kind of see how these risks are related to financial stability, and that we needed to include this in our work and our priorities for the coming years. So in 2018, we decided to develop a strategy. We joined in GFS, we joined SBN, which is another network for emerging markets that depends on the IFC, that it's more works more on opportunities, I guess. And since then, we're working in 4 main issues. First, taxonomy development. We're working with the government organizations in the country, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Environment, the Statistical Department of the country, in order to develop a national taxonomy to not only help organizations identify opportunities, but also to keep market integrity, which is also within our mandate, right? The second one was around disclosure. You know, as you know, many of supervisors around the world are working on this issue, and we what we wanted, and from a Latin American perspective, you have to take into the consideration that you need, when working on disclosure and mandating a stronger or better disclosure, ESG disclosure, you need to take into consideration that you need to balance the costs, the needs, and the international discussion. There's 3 elements you need to put into the equation, and we have been working for the past year on national diagnostic and on developing working tables or workshops with participants, market participants, in order to really get to a consensus in which the information investors needs are there. It's not too costly for issuers, but you're also aligned with what TCFD is putting in the table, the IFRS is discussing, and other supervisors in the regional were as publishing in their regulation. The third front was around institutional investors. We are also supervisors of capital markets participants. And when we did a diagnostic in the country, we realized the industries were lagging behind, the institutional investors, specifically pension fund administrator. So we decided to kind of level up the playing field in order to eventually be able to introduce policies such as the ESRM from investing and lending perspective. So we needed to level up the playing field. And for the past 2 years, we've been developing with them a good practice guideline. We hope this guideline will help build the capacity. It gave them time to really understand and incorporate this in their processes in order for us to start doing some implementation of risk. And finally, we needed to start testing around climate risk assessments, identifying how we are exposed to physical and transition risks from financial stability perspective, and we have been working on different exercises to really try to understand what are the data gaps, what are the capacity gaps, with who we need to partner in order to fill that data gaps, and those probably are these priorities are gonna continue for the next 6 months at least, or 8 months. So I will close it there.
Wow, you're busy.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. We're a little bit over time, so apologies for you, but I really want to hand over to you, Danny, in terms of sort of next on your agenda, then a closing word from you, Natasha. So over to you, Danny, please.
Well, I think the role of the academics is to provide additional ideas and to help move it along. So, you know, I think we more or less have an idea of what the framework should be. And now the next step is how you implement it more, and how you can bring this down to earth so that it actually be done. Now that's mostly something for practitioners, but nonetheless, academics can have a role. And some of us academics have been practitioners. So I think the next stage is to bring this down to earth and to have it happen. And I welcome Pascual's idea to have exchanges between different institutions in Latin America and members of ASBA that have done at different stages of implementation. That's a great way to learn. And it's also an unthreatening way to learn, because colleagues that have tried something, you know, it says, you know, it's useful. I hope that some of us academics can make some input into that. I look forward to Inspire doing so. I look forward to NGFS doing so. I mean, all this is a matter of learning, all of us learning together. And no doubt there'll be some mistakes, but you know, that's fine. That's part of how you learn when you find out what doesn't work in a particular place. But I think that's the, you know, the next step is to keep bringing it down to earth so that we can actually have something that's workable and respecting the differences. There's always a need to respect country differences. One size does not fit all. You know, a general pattern will fit. A suit is a suit, but the sizes are going to be different, and the length of the sleeves will be different, and so on and so forth. So you know, that's where I come out. You know, I think there's certainly work to be done, quite a bit of work to be done. But we know we've gone a bit of the way, and now we need to go ahead and make sure that it's actually implementable.
Well, fantastic, Danny, and thanks for bringing us together with this great report. So, Natasha, I'm just going to leave the last word to you on the Inspire network. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you once again to the Global Development Policy Centre hosting us today. In terms of next steps for Inspire, we encourage you to check out our website. You can connect with us on Twitter at inspire_sec. And we have an exciting new report project that we are working on in partnership with the NGFS and Danny, who is a member of the study group. And that will be coming out at the beginning of June. So it's something to look out for. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening.